the Russian Empire from March to November 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsarist Romanovs and the Provisional Government, afterwards seizing power, which caused a bloody civil war that would bring almost 5 years of tragedy to Russia. With their new power, the Bolsheviks would dissolve all Russian classes, luxury, and freedom, which would lead to them officially becoming the Soviet Union, the world's first communist country. This would, in the long term, bring tension between the communist Soviet Union and the democratic United States, creating half a century of wars and a clash of ideologies until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It all began in 1861 when serfdom was abolished in Russia by Tsar Alexander II out of fear of being overthrown by the serf population. A Tsar is a Russian name for a king, and a serf is a Russian name for a slave. Alexander gave each the tens of millions of new free peasant strips of land to farm on. However, as Russia's population grew, the rural peasant population could no longer get enough food off the land they farmed, and because of the frequent famines, many moved to the cities. This caused the population to explode in these cities, and there were not enough jobs and many became unemployed. In 1881, Alexander II was assassinated by an anti-Tsarist group called the People's Will. His son would become Tsar, and after his death in 1894, his son, Nicholas II, would be crowned Tsar. Nicholas II would be the last Tsar to ever rule Russia. In St. Petersburg on January 9, 1905, a peaceful crowd of 120,000 people marched towards the Tsar's home called the Winter Palace to ask him to sign a workers' rights bill. Tragically, the Tsar's guards mistook the march for a riot, and they opened fire onto the crowd. This event would be known as Bloody Sunday. At least 150 people were killed, and at least another 450 were wounded. This resulted in massive protests throughout Russia, which intensified after Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War. The protests continued until October 30, 1905, when Tsar Nicholas II signed the protesters' bill known as the October Manifesto. This would create the Duma, Russia's version of a parliament, ending the unlimited power of the Tsar. The problem with the Duma was that the Tsar could dismiss it and order new elections whenever he pleased, and he could change the number of votes it would take a person of each class to be part of the Duma. The first two Dumas had a wide variety of classes of the Russian population, but were both dismissed by the Tsar, who modified the voting system. The third Duma, created in 1907, consisted of nobles and wealthy land and factory owners. It would last for 5 years. In the city of St. Petersburg, a self-proclaimed holy man named Rasputin gained popularity among the upper class for his mystical power of healing and fortune-telling. Alexander's only son Alexei had a disease known as hemophilia, a disease where the person's blood does not clot properly, and results in excessive and possibly deadly bleeding from very small cuts. Rasputin would become a very influential advisor for the Romanovs. And 3 years later, the war to end all wars began, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Russia would enter World War I allied with Serbia and fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Tensions rose in Russia because the Tsarina Alexandria was from Germany. Even the name of the German-sounding capital of St. Petersburg was changed to a more Russian-sounding Petrograd. Russia mobilized 12 million people in World War I, and over 1.7 million Russians were killed, and 7.4 million were wounded, missing, or captured. Russia had terribly undersupplied military, and soldiers were told to grab the guns from the already deceased or fight with nothing. However, as more and more Russian losses occurred, people became increasingly angry at the high government officials, especially Rasputin. Rasputin used his political power to change the Russian cabinet at his will. During Rasputin's reign, Russia had 5 ministers of the interior, 3 ministers of war, foreign affairs, and transport, and 4 ministers of agriculture. It was obvious to many Russian people now that Rasputin was using the Romanovs as his puppet. On December 30th, 1916, Prince Felix Yusupov and other high government officials shot Rasputin and dumped him in the icy Neva River after he had failed to be killed by some poison cakes Felix had given him. With Rasputin gone, the Russian people started fighting against the war and the terrible food shortages. Still, the Tsar and the Duma would do nothing. Over time, more and more anti-Tsar groups emerged, and almost every major city had thousands of protesters rioting in the streets, asking for anything from food to women's rights. This would be the start of the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II tried to quell the riots, but it was to no avail. At the same time, a group of rebels had blocked off the railways to the Palace Tsarskoye Selo, which is where all the Romanovs, except for Nicholas, were staying at. Nicholas abdicated on March 15, 1917, after seeing his failure to end the strikes and fearing his family was in danger. In his abdication manifesto, Nicholas did not give the throne to his son Alexei, but to his brother Grand Duke Michael. Michael would also abdicate, and with no other living male heirs, 304 years of Romanov rule in Russia had come to an end. Immediately after the fall of the autocracy, the Romanovs were placed under house arrest and would later be moved to Siberia. The Tsardom was immediately replaced by a provisional government. This transitional government was a bureaucratic system used to manage the country when the old government system collapsed. The Russian provisional government was led by a man named George Labov in the Ninth Cabinet of Russia. Like the Third Duma, it mostly consisted of the upper class, but unlike the Duma, it listened to the people. Women could now vote, hold public office, and even a women's military unit was formed called the Women's Battalion. On April 16, 1917, Vladimir Lenin returned to Petrograd after 12 years of exile to rally the new Russian Bolshevik Party and gain supporters. His return speech made many dislike him for wanting to dismantle the already weak provisional government. Slowly, as the provisional government lost its already weak grip on the Russian population, Lenin started gaining more followers and learning what they wanted. He used phrases like bread, peace, land, and all power to the Soviets. By July of 1917, Lenin's word had spread to many Russians, and over 500,000 protesters filled the streets of Petrograd for reforms within the provisional government. But violence ensued. After days of protests, the provisional government held re-elections, resulting in many high officials becoming socialists or Menshevik. Both groups were close to Lenin's Bolshevik Party. Hundreds of thousands of supporters in the Bolshevik Party were able to form a coup and an army, and they waited for when the time was right. That time was November 6th and 7th, 1917. On the 6th, the Bolshevik armed coup seized the railroad stations, the electric power station, the main post office, and the main bridges, with very few civilians noticing it, much less the provisional government. The next day, on the 7th, the Bolshevik coup stormed the Winter Palace with minimal effort. A few hours later, the Bolsheviks also took the Peter and Paul Fortress. During the Bolshevik takeover, many of the provisional government officials fled to a different country or were put on political trial. Petrograd was now in the hands of the Bolsheviks, and so was Russia. Immediately following the Bolshevik takeover of Petrograd, a monarchist resistance known as the White Movement, who wanted to put Tsar Nicholas II back on the throne, declared war on the Bolsheviks, starting a bloody civil war. Within weeks of taking Petrograd, the Bolsheviks created dozens of laws to make all public and private wealth under government control. All other parties besides the Bolshevik Party were abolished. All luxury goods were sent to the state treasury for storage. The church and state were separated, allowing the Bolsheviks to take wealth from the Russian Orthodox Church. Next, a secret police called the Cheka were created to find and silence those who opposed the Bolsheviks. Many freedoms would be stripped away from the people, like the freedom of press or speech. On March 3, 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which saw Russia exit World War I because they gave up Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Crimea to the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. This accounted for 1/3 of their population, almost 1/3 of their land, and over half its factories. By July of 1918, the White Army was heading towards Ekaterinburg, and the Bolsheviks feared the White Movement would save the Romanovs. Lenin refused the execution of the Romanovs, but his officers defied him, and on July 17, 1918, the Romanovs were executed. The White Movement would take the city of Ekaterinburg only 8 days later, but it was too late for the Romanovs. Their corpses were put into acid and buried in the wilderness. The now disorganized and incapable White Army was crushed by the Bolsheviks, who changed their name to the Communist Party in 1920. Later that year, on December 30, 1922, Russia became the Soviet Union, the world's first communist country. Lenin would later die of a stroke in 1924, and a man named Joseph Stalin would become the next dictator. Stalin would be directly responsible for the deaths of over 40 million Soviets, from mass exile, execution, forced labor, and famine. The Soviet Union would later help start World War II with the Nazis by invading Poland. They would stay allied until the Nazis betrayed the Soviet Union when they attempted to invade them. The Soviet Union would spend the rest of the war on the Allies' side, and during the war, Russia would also reclaim most of the territory lost at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, except for Finland, who only lost a tiny portion of its territory during the Winter War. Following World War II, the Soviet Union would face the U.S. in the Cold War, which would shape the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet Union would finally fall on December 31, 1991, due to economic, political, and social pressures, dissolving into 15 different countries. Russia's changed a lot in the last century, from an autocratic czardom to a constitutional monarchy, to a provisional state, to a communist country, and now to a republic. The Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union show how tragedy, corruption, and evil can grow if people let it manifest and go unchecked before it is too late.